Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases in Appalachian history. Today we'll delve into the events that shook an entire community in the mountains of North Carolina in the midst of World War I. Before we begin, tell us in the comments, where are you watching from now? Let's unravel this dark mystery together. It was the autumn of 1916. North Carolina was living under the tension of a nation on the brink of global conflict. While news of the European war arrived by telegraph in coastal cities, time seemed to move differently in the Appalachian Mountains. There, amidst the misty peaks and deep valleys, entire communities lived isolated from the rest of the world, connected only by narrow trails that wound through dense forests of oak and pine. Madison County, located in western North Carolina, was one of those places where modernity had barely arrived. Rural properties sprawled across steep hillsides, separated by miles of dense forest. The nearest town that could be called civilized was nearly 2 days' journey away on horseback. Winters were brutal, with blizzards that isolated families for weeks. And it was in this remote and unforgiving setting that Silas Ward's story began to unfold. Silas was known locally as a loner. Around 45 years old, he had built his cabin high on a ridge, far from any neighbors. Smoke billowing from his chimney during the day was uncommon. He avoided the small Baptist churches that dotted the county, and rarely went down to the general store in Marshall, the county seat. When he did, he would buy basic provisions and then quickly disappear back into the mountains. No one knew for sure where he came from, or why he had chosen this forgotten place to live. The community's elders remembered that Silas had arrived there around 1908, perhaps from Tennessee or Virginia. No one knew for sure. He paid cash, never borrowed, and avoided the territorial disputes that occasionally agitated local families. There was something about the way he looked at people that made even the bravest men look away. His eyes were too clear, almost transparent, and his voice rarely rose above a deep murmur. For the first few years, Silas Ward remained just a strange figure on the fringes of the collective consciousness. But in the summer of 1915, something began to change. Families living relatively close to Silas's property, even if close meant being a few miles away, began reporting strange things. Lights appearing in the woods at night, always coming from the direction of the ridge where Silas lived. These weren't ordinary lantern lights, but bright, intermittent flashes that lasted for hours. John Mercer, a farmer who owned land in the valley below Ward's property, was one of the first to mention something more disturbing. It was early September 1915, when he and his eldest son were checking traps near the ridge. As they approached the area where Silas kept his cabin, they heard sounds that John would later describe as something between moaning and singing. It wasn't music, not exactly. It was somewhat rhythmic, yes, but no recognizable melody. The sound came from within the dense woods, and both father and son felt an inexplicable unease. They decided to return home immediately. When John mentioned the incident at Marshall's warehouse a few weeks later, other men admitted to hearing similar things, but no one had gotten close enough to investigate. After all, Silas Ward was on his own property, and in the Appalachian Mountains, there was an unwritten code of respect for other people's land. Besides, times were hard. The rural economy was in decline. Young men were leaving the mountains to seek work in the textile mills back east, and no one wanted to stir up unnecessary trouble with neighbors, no matter how strange. The winter of 1915 to 1916 was particularly severe. Heavy snowfall began in November and lasted until March. During these months, properties were virtually isolated. It was common for families to not see each other for weeks, sometimes months. When spring finally arrived and the dirt roads began to dry, the first absences began to be noticed, and it was then that our story truly begins to take on its darkest hues. Sarah Holt was 17 years old, the eldest daughter of Thomas Holt, a shepherd who owned a few cattle in the valley. In early April of 1916, Sarah left home at dawn to fetch water from a nearby stream. She knew the path by heart. She had walked it hundreds of times. The distance to the stream was no more than a few minutes' walk, but Sarah never returned home. When the sun began to set and she had not returned, Thomas gathered neighbors, and they began a search that would last 3 full days. They found absolutely nothing. Not the bucket she was carrying, not any sign of a struggle, not even any tracks to indicate where she might have gone. The community was shaken by Sarah Holt's disappearance. For weeks, groups of men scoured the surrounding forests, explored known caves in the area, and followed every stream and trail they could find. Thomas Holt was devastated. His wife, Martha, could barely get out of bed. Neighbors brought food and offered prayers, but there was no solace for a family who had lost a daughter without even knowing what had happened to her. The Madison County Sheriff, a man named Robert Clay, personally came to the Holt property to conduct what would be an official investigation. Clay was in his 50s and had been sheriff for over a decade. He knew these mountains like few others, having grown up there. But even with all his experience, Sarah Holt's case perplexed him. There were no leads. None. It was as if the young woman had simply vanished into thin air. During interviews with neighbors and locals, Silas Ward's name came up a few times, not because anyone had seen Silas near the disappearance site, but simply because he was the area's stranger, the outsider no one knew anything about. Sheriff Clay decided to pay a visit to Ward's property. It was a difficult hike to the ridge where Silas lived. The trail was steep and nearly impassable in several places. Clay took 2 deputies with him, burly men accustomed to the mountainous terrain. When they finally arrived at Silas Ward's cabin, they found the man working in his small garden. Silas greeted them with cool courtesy. His cabin was modest but well-maintained. Firewood was stacked with military precision beside the building. A few chickens scratched in the yard. Everything seemed remarkably normal. Sheriff Clay explained the reason for his visit and asked if Silas had seen or heard anything unusual in the past few weeks. Silas replied that he had not. He said he rarely left his property and knew nothing about young Holt's disappearance. The deputies requested permission to look inside the cabin. Silas didn't hesitate. He opened the door and invited them in. The interior was Spartan, a simple bed in a corner, a table with 2 chairs, a wood-burning stove, and shelves stocked with basic provisions. A few books were stacked near the bed, most with worn covers and titles Clay didn't recognize. Nothing there seemed suspicious. Nothing there indicated any involvement in Sarah's disappearance. The sheriff thanked him, and the 3 men descended the mountain. But something was bothering Robert Clay. Perhaps it was Silas's excessive calm, or the way his eyes betrayed no emotion when he heard about a missing young woman. It was hard to say. May arrived, bringing wildflowers and milder temperatures. Life continued in the mountains, though the Holt family remained mired in mourning. And then it happened again. This time it was a young man named Daniel Pierce, 21 years old, the son of a family who lived a few miles north of the Holt property. Daniel had gone hunting one Saturday morning, taking his shotgun and a hunting dog with him. He knew these woods perfectly. He was considered one of the best trackers in the region. When night fell and Daniel didn't return, his father, William Pierce, felt a chill run down his spine. He knew Sarah Holt's story. Everyone did. The search for Daniel Pierce was even more intense than the search for Sarah. Dozens of men gathered from properties scattered across the county. They searched for 5 days. They found Daniel's dog on the 3rd day, wandering alone near a tributary of the French Broad River. The animal was frightened but unharmed. There was no sign of Daniel or his shotgun. It was as if he had simply vanished from the face of the earth. Sheriff Clay visited Silas Ward again. This time the conversation was more tense. Clay asked directly if Silas owned any firearms. Silas confirmed he had an antique rifle for protection against wildlife. Clay asked to see it. Silas brought out the gun, which was clean but had clearly not been used for years. It wasn't Daniel Pierce's shotgun. Clay asked if Silas had heard gunshots the morning Daniel disappeared. Silas said no, that he had been working on his property all day and hadn't heard anything unusual. Again, there was nothing concrete to incriminate the man, but suspicion was beginning to grow in the sheriff's mind. June brought a humid heat to the Appalachian valleys. News of the 2 disappearances had spread beyond Madison County. Newspapers in Asheville, the nearest major city, began publishing brief articles about the mysterious cases in the mountains. Some families began keeping their children closer to home. Men began carrying weapons even during the day. A climate of fear and distrust began to take hold in the community. It was in this context that the 3rd disappearance occurred. Emma Caldwell was 32 years old and a teacher at a small school that served the children of local farmers. Emma lived alone in a small house near the school, about a kilometer from the property where she taught. She was respected by all, known for her dedication to her students and her kindness. On the night of June 23, 1916, Emma didn't show up for school in the morning. When some parents went to check on her house, they found the door unlocked and signs that she had started to prepare breakfast, but something had interrupted her. The kettle was still on the stove. There was half-eaten bread on the table, but Emma was gone. This time the panic was immediate. 3 disappearances in less than 3 months was unprecedented. Sheriff Clay sent telegrams asking state authorities for help. An investigator from Raleigh, North Carolina's capital, was assigned to assist in the investigation. His name was Marcus Webb, a methodical man experienced in complex cases. Webb arrived in Madison County in late June and immediately began reviewing every detail of the 3 disappearances. Marcus Webb was unlike most mountain men. He wore a suit even in the summer heat, carried a leather briefcase full of papers, and had a habit of writing down absolutely everything in a small notebook that never left his pocket. He spent his first days interviewing victims' families, reconstructing the last known moments of each missing person, and studying detailed maps of the region. Webb was meticulous. He measured distances, noted times, and asked seemingly inconsequential questions that revealed his analytical mind. One of the first things Webb noticed was a geographic pattern. When he plotted the approximate locations of each person's disappearance on the map, he realized that all the dots formed an irregular semicircle, and in the approximate center of this semicircle, atop the highest ridge in the area, was Silas Ward's property. The distance varied, of course. Sarah Holt had disappeared about 3 miles from Silas's cabin. Daniel Pierce was about 4 miles away. Emma Caldwell was about 4 miles away, but all within this area that seemed to radiate from the lone man's property. Webb shared his observations with Sheriff Clay. They both agreed they needed to investigate Silas Ward more deeply, but they also knew they needed more than just geographical suspicions. They needed concrete evidence. Webb decided he needed to know more about Silas Ward. Where had he come from? Why had he chosen this remote location? What had he been doing all that time alone on the mountain? These questions began to consume the investigator. Webb began a search for records. He visited the county clerk's office in Marshall and discovered that Silas Ward had purchased his property in 1908, paying cash. The seller was a man who had already died, so there was no way to question him. Webb tried to find records of where Silas had lived before arriving in North Carolina, but there was nothing. No birth records, no official documents other than the property deed. It was as if Silas Ward simply didn't exist before 1908. While Webb investigated Silas's past, Sheriff Clay organized discreet stakeouts on the property. Groups of volunteer men took turns observing the cabin from afar, using binoculars and recording Silas's movements. For 2 weeks they saw nothing but normal, everyday activities. Silas tended his garden, fed the chickens, and chopped firewood. Occasionally he went down to the nearby stream to fetch water. At night, the light of a lantern could be seen through the cabin window until late. All terribly ordinary. But there were nights when things changed. On 3 separate occasions during those 2 weeks of surveillance, the observers reported seeing Silas leave his cabin well after midnight, carrying a lantern and heading into the thickest part of the forest behind their property. He would disappear into the trees and be gone for hours. Once he didn't return until just before dawn. What was he doing there in the darkness of the forest? The men keeping watch considered following him, but the woods were too dense and treacherous at night. Attempts to track him might alert him that he was being watched. Webb was intrigued by these reports. He decided he needed to explore the woods behind Silas's property during the daylight hours, when he could see where he was going. In early July of 1916, Webb, accompanied by Sheriff Clay and 3 local men who knew the area well, undertook a careful expedition through the area. They climbed the ridge, passed Silas's cabin when they knew he had gone down to Marshall to buy provisions, and entered the dense woods. The forest was dense and ancient. Huge trees blocked much of the sunlight. The ground was covered in a thick layer of dead leaves accumulated over decades, perhaps centuries. There was a heavy silence in the place, broken only by the occasional distant bird call. They walked for over an hour, following what appeared to be a barely discernible trail. It was difficult to tell if it was truly a trail or just a natural terrain formation. It was then that one of the local men, an experienced hunter named Joseph Martin, noticed strange markings on some trees. They were deliberate carvings, made with some kind of sharp tool. The carvings formed symbols no one recognized. They weren't letters of the common alphabet, nor numbers. They looked more like primitive drawings or ancient runes. Webb made detailed sketches of each symbol in his notebook. There were at least 12 trees marked this way, all within a relatively small area. Following the trail of marked trees, the group arrived at a small circular clearing. In the center of the clearing was a rudimentary structure made of stacked stones. It wasn't exactly an altar, but it wasn't a natural formation either. The stones had clearly been placed there by human hands. Around the stone structure, the ground was free of vegetation, as if it were regularly cleared. Webb approached carefully and examined the stones. There were dark stains on some of them. Stains that could have been anything, but they made the researcher's heart race. Webb asked one of the men to go to the nearest town with a doctor and bring back someone who could analyze the stains. While they waited, the group continued exploring the clearing and its surroundings. Joseph Martin found something disturbing a few meters from the stone structure. They were bones. Not many, and not obviously human at first glance. They could have been animal bones, deer perhaps, or other wild animals, but the quantity and arrangement suggested otherwise. There were also fragments of tissue caught in some nearby bushes, tissue that appeared to have been exposed to the elements for some time. The doctor arrived the next day, a young man named Henry Sutton, who had studied at a university in the north and brought with him knowledge of basic forensic analysis. Sutton examined the stains on the stones, and although he couldn't be completely certain without more sophisticated equipment, declared that the stains were consistent with blood. As for the bones, Sutton needed more time. He carefully collected them and promised to examine them more closely in his office. At that moment, Webb and Clay knew they had found something significant. The question now was how to proceed. Silas Ward hadn't yet been charged with anything. They had no direct evidence linking him to the disappearances, but that clearing in the woods, the symbols on the trees, the bloodstains, and the bones all painted a deeply disturbing picture. Webb decided it was time to confront Silas directly, but strategically. He didn't want to alert the man prematurely and risk destroying evidence, or Silas himself fleeing. Webb's strategy was simple, but risky. He would return to Silas Ward's property, this time alone, posing as someone interested in purchasing land in the area. Webb hoped that a more casual approach, without the intimidating presence of the sheriff and his deputies, might lull Silas's guard and reveal something useful. It was a gamble, but Webb was confident in his ability to read people and extract information from seemingly harmless conversations. On the morning of July 9, 1916, Webb hiked up the trail to Silas's cabin. The day was hot and humid, and by the time he reached the top of the ridge, his shirt was soaked with sweat. Silas was outside, sharpening a blade against a whetstone. He looked up as Webb approached, but he didn't seem surprised or alarmed. It was as if unexpected visitors were something he'd already expected. Webb introduced himself using a false name and explained that he was considering moving to the area, that he was looking for a quiet place away from the cities. Silas watched him silently for a long moment before responding. His voice was low, almost a whisper. He said the mountains were indeed peaceful, perhaps too peaceful for some. Webb asked how long Silas had lived there. His answer was vague, something like 8 or 9 years, maybe a little longer. Silas didn't seem particularly interested in long conversations. Webb tried a different approach. He mentioned the recent disappearances, saying he'd heard about them in town, and that it worried him. Was the area really safe? Silas shrugged slightly. He said mountains had always been dangerous places. People got lost, fell off cliffs, encountered bears or other predators. It had been happening forever. Webb watched Silas's eyes closely as he spoke. There was no emotion there, no trace of concern or empathy. It was like talking to a stone wall. Trying to keep the conversation going, Webb asked about the woods behind the property. He said he'd seen interesting trails and asked if Silas often hunted there. The change in Silas was subtle but noticeable. His eyes narrowed slightly, and he took a second longer to answer. He said yes, he sometimes walked through those woods, but that they were old trails, likely made by animals or the indigenous people who lived there long ago. Webb pressed a little further, mentioning that he'd seen some strange markings on trees. Silas remained still. The silence that followed was thick and uncomfortable. Finally, Silas spoke. He said there were many things in the mountains that outsiders didn't understand, ancient traditions, ancient knowledge that had been preserved by those who knew where to look. His voice had taken on a different tone, almost reverent. Webb felt a shiver run down his spine. He asked what Silas meant by that. Silas merely shook his head slowly and said there were things that shouldn't be discussed with outsiders. The conversation was clearly over. Webb thanked them for their time and headed back down the mountain, his mind buzzing with what he had just witnessed. Meanwhile, Dr. Sutton had completed his examination of the bones found in the clearing. His results were disturbing. Of the bones collected, at least 3 were definitely human. One was a femur fragment, another appeared to be part of a rib, and the third was possibly a forearm bone. Sutton couldn't determine with certainty how many different people the bones came from, nor was there any way to establish specific identities without more advanced forensic techniques that simply didn't exist in 1916. But the presence of human bones in that isolated clearing was, in itself, sufficient evidence that something terrible had happened there. Sheriff Clay called an urgent meeting with Webb and some local community leaders. The situation was delicate. They had human bones, bloodstains, mysterious symbols, and a suspect displaying highly suspicious behavior, but they had no direct evidence linking Silas Ward to the 3 recent disappearances. There were no witnesses, no confession, and no identifiable bodies. In a court of law, even if they managed to arrest Silas, it would be difficult to secure a conviction with the evidence they had. It was decided they needed more. Webb suggested organizing a more extensive search of Silas's property and the surrounding area. Perhaps there were other locations like that clearing. Perhaps there was more evidence hidden somewhere. Sheriff Clay agreed, but knew he would need more men. He began recruiting volunteers, brave men willing to search those dark woods for answers. On July 15th, a group of nearly 30 men gathered in Marshall. They were divided into smaller teams, each responsible for exploring a specific section of the area surrounding Silas Ward's property. The search would be methodical and thorough. Nothing would be left to chance. Silas himself had been informed of the operation. Webb thought it best not to try to hide it. Silas didn't protest, didn't seem concerned. He simply watched the men scatter through the woods with that vacant, unsettling look that had become his trademark. For 3 days, the group searched the area. They found more trees with engraved symbols, forming what appeared to be a complex pattern stretching for several kilometers. They found 2 other, smaller clearings, both with similar structures of stacked stones. In one, there were more bones. In another, they found the remains of an old backpack, so deteriorated by time and the elements that it was impossible to determine who owned it or how long it had been there. One of the groups, led by Joseph Martin, made a discovery that would completely change the course of the research. They were exploring a particularly dense area of the forest, following a small stream that cascaded irregularly down the mountainside. At one point, the stream passed through a rock formation that created a sort of shallow cave. Joseph noticed something strange about the cave entrance. There appeared to be wooden planks partially hidden by branches and foliage. Upon approaching and removing the camouflage, they discovered that someone had built a rudimentary door there. Joseph Martin and his men hesitated for a moment before the makeshift door. Something was deeply wrong about this place. The air felt cooler here, even in the summer heat. The sound of the stream, which had once seemed tranquil, now sounded almost ominous. But they had come here seeking answers, and they could not back down now. Joseph pushed open the door, which creaked loudly, shattering the silence of the forest. What they saw on the other side would give them nightmares for the rest of their lives. The cave extended deeper into the mountain than it appeared from the outside. Someone had expanded the natural space, digging deeper into the rock. The ceiling was low, forcing the men to stoop to enter. Oil lamps were positioned in niches carved into the walls, suggesting the place was visited regularly. But what really caught the eye was what was scattered across the uneven cave floor. There were personal belongings, many of them. A woman's headscarf, a belt buckle, clothing buttons, fragments of fabric of varying colors, and more bones, many more bones than they had found in the clearings. Joseph felt his stomach churn. He ordered one of the men to run back to inform Sheriff Clay and Webb of the discovery. While they waited, the group remained at the cave entrance, none of them wanting to go deeper into that horrific place. It was then that they heard footsteps approaching. Everyone turned quickly, hands on their weapons. But it wasn't Silas Ward. It was a boy, no more than 12 or 13 years old, thin and in torn clothes. He stopped a few feet away, looking at the men with a mixture of fear and confusion. Joseph approached slowly, trying not to frighten the boy. He asked his name. The boy took a moment to answer, as if he'd forgotten how to speak. Finally, he said his name was Timothy. Joseph asked what he was doing there, so far from any home. Timothy looked at the cave and then back at the men. He said he lived there. Joseph felt his blood run cold. Did he live there? In the cave? The boy shook his head. Not exactly in the cave, in a nearby cabin, with the mountain man, with Silas. The revelations that followed were devastating. Timothy recounted in a hesitant, weak voice that he had been brought to this place over a year ago. He didn't remember exactly where he had come from before, only that he had been traveling with his family when he became separated from them somewhere in the mountains. Silas found him, or at least that's what Timothy initially thought. Silas said he would help him find his family, but instead, he took him to his property. At first, Silas was kind. He fed the boy and offered him a place to sleep. But then things changed. Silas began to speak of ancient knowledge, of rituals that needed to be performed, of how the mountains demanded certain tributes to keep their secrets. Timothy didn't fully understand what Silas meant, but he knew it was very wrong. He had seen Silas bring other people to those places in the forest, people who never returned. Timothy never witnessed exactly what happened. Silas always sent him away first, but the boy heard sounds that terrified him, and then he saw Silas return alone, carrying only the clothes or belongings of the people who had disappeared. Timothy said he tried to escape several times, but always got lost in the vastness of the forest. Silas always found him and brought him back. After a few failed attempts, the boy simply gave up. He lived in a constant state of terror, running errands for Silas, remaining as invisible as possible, hoping for a miracle to save him from this nightmare. And now, perhaps, that miracle had finally arrived in the form of these men. When Sheriff Clay and Webb arrived at the cave, accompanied by more deputies, they listened to Timothy's entire story again. Webb took detailed notes, noting every detail the boy could remember. It was extraordinary testimony, possibly enough to finally arrest Silas Ward. But first they needed to document everything in the cave. Dr. Sutton was called back. He arrived at dusk and began his gruesome examination by lamplight. Sutton worked methodically, cataloguing each item found. The bones indicated at least 4 different individuals, possibly more. Some of the personal belongings were identified. The headscarf, for example, was recognized by Sarah Holt's mother as belonging to her daughter. A belt buckle was identified by William Pierce as identical to the one his son Daniel wore. Piece by piece, the evidence accumulated, building an irrefutable case against Silas Ward. While work continued on the cave, Sheriff Clay organized a posse to arrest Silas. They climbed to his cabin as night fell, but Silas was not there. The cabin was empty. His few possessions remained, but the man himself was gone. Clay ordered an immediate search. Men with torches fanned out into the woods, shouting Silas's name, searching for any sign of his passing. But it was as if he had melted into the shadows of the mountains. For 2 full days, the search for Silas Ward continued without success. Some men suggested he might have fallen off a cliff or gotten lost in the caves that dotted the area. Others believed he knew the area too well for that he had simply fled and was probably long gone. Webb wasn't sure what to think. Part of him wanted to believe Silas was still nearby, hiding in some secret place known only to him. But another part knew that a man like Silas, who had managed to conceal such horrific activities for so long, surely had escape plans in place long ago. On the 3rd day of searching, one of the groups made a final discovery that would put a bizarre end to the whole story. They were exploring an area further south of Silas's property, following a deep ravine that ran parallel to the main ridge. At the bottom of the ravine, partially covered by fallen branches and foliage, they found a body. It was Silas Ward, or at least that was what remained of him. Silas Ward's body was in such a state that it was difficult to determine exactly what had happened. He lay on his back at the bottom of the ravine, his pale eyes still open, staring at the sky through the treetops. There were no obvious signs of serious external injuries, no visible blood, no broken bones visible through his clothes. It was as if he had simply lain there and decided to stop living. Dr. Sutton was called in once more to examine the body. He worked carefully, knowing that every detail could be important. Sutton estimated that Silas had been dead for approximately 2 days, perhaps a little longer. The cause of death was not immediately apparent. There were no signs of strangulation, knife wounds, or gunshot wounds. Sutton suggested it could have been the heart, some sort of sudden collapse or possibly poisoning. Without proper equipment for a full autopsy, it would be impossible to be absolutely certain. Webb observed the scene with meticulous attention. Something was deeply disturbing him. The body position was too strange to be natural. Silas stood perfectly aligned, his arms at his sides, his legs stretched out. It wasn't the posture of someone who had fallen or tripped. It was the posture of someone who had deliberately laid down. Webb walked around the ravine, examining the terrain. There were no signs of a struggle, no footprints other than Silas's. It was as if he had come here alone for a specific purpose. Near the body, partially hidden under some leaves, Webb found something that made his heart race. It was a small, empty glass vial, with dark residue at the bottom. Webb carefully picked it up and showed it to Sutton. The doctor examined the vial, sniffed cautiously, and frowned. There was a distinct, bitter odor. Sutton said he couldn't be certain without proper analysis, but he suspected the vial had contained some kind of poison. Perhaps an extract from toxic plants that grew abundantly in those mountains. Belladonna, hemlock, or one of the many other poisonous species native to the region. The possibility that Silas Ward had taken his own life was disturbing in a different way. It meant he knew he was about to be captured and chose death rather than face justice. Or perhaps there was something more. Perhaps those strange rituals, those bizarre beliefs about the mountains and their secrets, had included some kind of pact Silas felt he needed to honor. Webb didn't know, and suspected he never would. Silas Ward had taken his deepest secrets with him to the grave. The body was transported back to Marshall, where it would be prepared for burial. There was no known family to claim the body, and no relatives emerged. Sheriff Clay decided that Silas would be buried in the county cemetery, in a section reserved for indigents and those without family. There would be no ceremony, no mourning, just a shallow grave and a simple marker. Meanwhile, the work of cataloging and identifying the evidence found in the cave and clearings continued. Webb spent days reviewing each item, trying to reconstruct the chronology of events. It became clear that the three recent disappearances of Sarah Holt, Daniel Pierce, and Emma Caldwell were not the first. The bones and belongings found suggested there had been other victims, possibly many more, throughout the years Silas had lived in those mountains. Timothy, the boy who had been held by Silas, was taken to Sheriff Clay's house while attempts were made to locate his family. The boy was traumatized, often waking up screaming during the night, but gradually began to recover. He provided more details about his experience, though many of his memories were fragmented and confused. Timothy mentioned that Silas spoke constantly of voices he heard in the mountains, of ancient spirits demanding sacrifices, of how he had been chosen to serve forces that existed before the first settlers arrived in these lands. It was difficult to separate reality from delirium in Silas's words, as reported by Timothy. Webb suspected that Silas Ward suffered from some kind of severe mental illness, possibly exacerbated by prolonged isolation, but that didn't diminish the enormity of his actions. Innocent people had lost their lives, families had been torn apart, and an entire community had lived under the shadow of fear for months. News of the case's resolution spread quickly. Newspapers across North Carolina published articles about the Appalachian hermit killer and his victims. Some journalists traveled to Madison County to write more in-depth reports. Webb gave few interviews, preferring to let his facts speak for themselves. Sheriff Clay became something of a local hero, though he himself wasn't comfortable with the attention. For the victims' families, there was no real consolation. The Holts were at least able to bury some remains that were identified as Sarah's. The Pierces did the same with what was identified as Daniel's. Emma Caldwell was buried based on a few belongings and bone fragments that were likely hers. But absolute certainty was impossible with the forensic limitations of the time. The families would have to live with the doubt that maybe, just maybe, their conclusions were wrong. Silas Ward's property was officially confiscated by the county. No one wanted to buy it, no one wanted to live in that place stained with such darkness. The cabin was eventually burned by order of Sheriff Clay, who felt that leaving it standing would be like maintaining a macabre memorial. The clearings in the forest were cleared, the stones scattered, and the trees marked with symbols to warn hunters and travelers to avoid those places. As for the cave, the entrance was sealed with heavy rocks, creating a permanent tomb for the horrors that had occurred there. Webb returned to Raleigh in late August 1916, carrying with him a case that would haunt him for the rest of his career. He wrote a detailed 230-page report on the investigation, a document that would be filed in state records and occasionally consulted by other investigators for decades to come. In his report, Webb speculated that Silas Ward had been responsible for at least 8 deaths, possibly more. The exact number would never be known. The months following Silas Ward's death brought a strange mixture of relief and unease to Madison County. The immediate fear had passed. Children once again played freely near the woods. Men resumed their hunting without constantly looking over their shoulders. But something lingered in the air, a persistent sense that these mountains held secrets beyond human comprehension. People began to whisper about strange things that had always happened in this region, stories that had been forgotten or ignored until the events involving Silas brought them back to mind. Old-timers in the community recalled other disappearances over the years, cases that at the time were attributed to accidents or people who simply decided to leave without warning. A man named Ezekiel Porter, who disappeared in 1911 while searching for a lost cow. A woman named Ruth Anderson, who went out to gather medicinal herbs in 1912 and never returned. A traveling couple who asked for directions in Marshall in 1913 and then simply vanished before reaching the next town. How many of these cases could be connected to Silas Ward? No one could say for sure, but suspicions persisted. Timothy, the boy who had been held by Silas, eventually had his family located. They lived in Tennessee, about 100 miles away. The reunion was emotional but also painful. Timothy's parents had searched for him for over a year, scouring entire counties, making signs, begging for any information. When they finally found him, he was different, thinner, quieter, with a distant look in his eyes that wouldn't fade even when surrounded by his family. The experiences he had endured with Silas Ward had left scars that would likely never fully heal. Before leaving with his family, Timothy asked to speak with Webb one last time. The investigator had already returned to Raleigh, but made a special trip back to Madison County to fulfill the boy's request. They met at the small Marshall Baptist Church, a quiet place where Timothy said he felt safe. The boy had something he needed to tell, something he'd kept to himself because he wasn't sure anyone would believe him. Timothy said that the night before Joseph Martin's men discovered the cave, Silas had acted strangely, even stranger than usual. He had woken Timothy in the middle of the night and asked him to follow him into the forest. The boy, terrified but with no other option, obeyed. Silas led him to one of the clearings, the one with the largest stone structure. There, by the light of a lamp, Silas began speaking as if to someone invisible. He begged forgiveness, saying he had failed, that he had failed to complete what had been asked of him. Timothy couldn't understand who Silas was talking to, as there was no one else there. But Silas seemed genuinely terrified. His hands were shaking, his face was pale. Then Silas turned to Timothy and said something the boy would never forget. He said the mountains always took their toll, that he had tried to feed the hunger in those lands, but it would never be enough. He said that now that he had been discovered, someone else would eventually take his place, because the hunger never ended. Timothy asked Webb if he thought this was true, if there really was something evil in those mountains that had corrupted Silas Ward. Webb didn't know what to say. He was a man of science and reason, but he had also seen things during that investigation that he couldn't fully explain. Webb thanked Timothy for his courage in sharing his story and promised to keep it documented in his private records. He watched the boy leave with his family, part of him relieved that Timothy was finally free, part of him disturbed by the implications of what he had heard. Could Silas Ward not just be a lone killer, but someone influenced by something larger and darker? It was a question Webb knew he couldn't answer, at least not with the tools he possessed. Autumn arrived early in that year of 1916. The leaves began to change color in September, painting the mountains with hues of red, orange, and gold. Life in the region slowly returned to its normal rhythm. Harvests were gathered, livestock were prepared for winter, and families turned to the daily concerns of survival in the mountains. But there were times, especially at dusk when shadows lengthened between the trees, when people avoided looking up at the ridge where Silas Ward's cabin had once stood. Some claimed to have seen strange lights in that direction during the darkest nights. Others swore they heard sounds coming from the forest, those same rhythmic, disturbing sounds that had been reported years before. Sheriff Clay investigated some of these reports himself, but never found anything. He attributed most of these claims to the overstimulated imaginations of people deeply affected by recent events. But even Clay, a pragmatic and skeptical man by nature, privately admitted that there was something about those mountains that he could not adequately explain. In November, a minor incident brought back memories for Silas Ward. A hunter named Lucas Brennan was tracking a wounded deer when he got lost in the woods. He wandered for nearly 2 days before finding his way back. When he finally returned to civilization, he was visibly shaken. Brennan said he had stumbled upon one of the old clearings, the one that must have been cleared months earlier, but the stones were back in place, rearranged in the same formation they had been before, and there were fresh marks on the ground around it, as if someone had recently performed some kind of ceremony there. Sheriff Clay gathered some men and returned to the clearing. Indeed, the stones had been rearranged, but there was no other evidence of recent human presence. No clear footprints, no trail to follow. Clay ordered the stones scattered again, this time carried away and thrown into a deep ravine. He also posted rudimentary signs on surrounding trees, warning that the area was county property and unauthorized entry would be considered trespassing. But questions persisted. Who had rearranged those stones? Could Silas Ward have had an accomplice who was never discovered? Or were there other people in the mountains who shared his strange beliefs and were trying to continue what he had started? Webb, when he learned of the incident through a letter from Clay, suggested that perhaps it was the work of some morbid curiosity, or even journalists seeking to create further sensationalism. But this explanation didn't completely satisfy either man. The winter of 1916 to 1917 was particularly harsh, mirroring the winter of the previous year when it all began. Heavy snowfalls once again isolated the scattered mountain estates. During these months of forced isolation, the stories about Silas Ward took on a different form. Around their firesides, as the storms howled outside, people began to tell increasingly elaborate versions of events, adding details that might not be entirely true but made the narratives more frightening. Some claimed Silas Ward wasn't actually human, but some kind of evil spirit that had taken human form. Others claimed he had made a pact with demonic forces in exchange for forbidden knowledge. Some swore his eyes glowed in the dark like those of a predatory animal. When Webb eventually heard some of these stories during a visit to the county the following spring, he became concerned. He understood the human need to transform real horrors into myths and legends, but he also feared that the truth would be completely lost in the process. The truth, as Webb understood it, was disturbing enough without embellishment. Silas Ward had been a deeply troubled man who had committed monstrous acts driven by delusions and possibly undiagnosed mental illness. Transforming him into some kind of supernatural monster, while understandable from a psychological standpoint, only served to obscure the real lessons to be learned from the case. Webb gave a few talks at local churches, trying to bring people back to the facts, but he knew he was fighting against a powerful tide of human imagination. In the spring of 1917, the United States finally entered World War I. Young men from across the country, including the mountains of North Carolina, began enlisting or were drafted to serve. The nation's attention turned to the distant battlefields of Europe, and the events in Madison County gradually faded from the headlines. For the people who lived there, however, the memories remained vivid and close. Thomas Holt, Sarah's father, never fully recovered from the loss of his daughter. He continued to work his land and tend his cattle, but something essential in him had been broken. His wife, Martha, eventually convinced the family to move to a smaller town further east, away from the mountains that now held so many painful memories. They left in May of 1917, selling their property for far less than it was worth. The buyer was a man from Virginia who didn't know the full story of what had happened in the area. William Pierce, Daniel's father, took a different path. He became obsessed with mapping and documenting every trail and clearing in the mountains surrounding his property. He would spend entire days in the woods, taking detailed notes, marking trees, creating what he called a safety guide, so no one would ever get lost or fall victim to human predators lurking in the shadows. Sheriff Clay initially supported this effort, but gradually realized it had become more of an unhealthy obsession than a useful project. Pierce was essentially trying to control the uncontrollable, to tame the vast wilderness that had taken his son. The family of Emma Caldwell, the missing teacher, established a small fund in her memory to improve education in rural areas of the county. They believed Emma would have appreciated being remembered this way, contributing to something positive rather than just being another victim in a horror story. A new school was eventually built, partially funded by this fund, and named the Emma Caldwell School. It was a simple wooden structure, but it represented hope and a future in a community that had faced so much darkness. Webb continued his career as an investigator, working on numerous cases over the following years. But the Silas Ward case remained special, one he revisited in his thoughts during sleepless nights. He corresponded with Sheriff Clay for many years, exchanging letters on various subjects, but inevitably returning to the events of 1916. In a letter written in 1920, Clay mentioned receiving a curious report from a farmer who lived near Silas's former property. The farmer, whose name Clay did not mention in the letter, claimed to have found a notebook hidden in a hollow tree near where Silas's cabin had stood. The notebook was partially damaged by moisture, but parts were still legible. Clay had leafed through the notebook and was deeply disturbed by what he read. These were Silas Ward's personal notes, a sort of irregular diary he kept. The entries were not consistently dated, but they seemed to cover several years. What Clay read in that notebook revealed a fragmented and tormented mind. Silas wrote of voices that woke him at night, voices that spoke in languages he didn't recognize, but somehow understood. He wrote of recurring dreams, in which he walked through endless forests, following shadowy figures that always remained just out of reach. He spoke of a growing compulsion, something that pulled him to those forest clearings, forcing him to perform rituals whose full meaning he himself didn't understand. One particularly disturbing entry described Silas's first encounter with what he called the hunger of the mountains. He wrote that he had climbed to the highest point of his property during a moonless night, and there felt something he could not adequately describe in words. It wasn't exactly a physical presence, but neither was it just his imagination. It was as if the earth itself was alive and conscious, watching him, judging him, testing him. Silas wrote that in that moment he understood he had been chosen for some purpose, though what purpose exactly remained unclear. Other entries documented his growing paranoia and isolation. He wrote about how he could no longer trust people, how he saw evil and corruption in every face he encountered in the city. He described how the voices in his head grew louder, more insistent, demanding actions that he initially resisted but eventually gave into. There was a clear progression visible throughout the pages, a gradual descent from someone who had perhaps once been relatively normal to someone completely lost in his own delusions. Clay offered to send the notebook to Webb, but the investigator declined. He wrote back saying he'd seen enough of the darkness that inhabited Silas Ward's mind. Reading more would only plunge deeper into a bottomless abyss from which it might be difficult to return. Clay understood and decided to lock the notebook in his office safe, where it would remain as evidence should it ever be needed. Years passed, and Madison County continued its quiet existence, though forever scarred by the events that had occurred. In 1925, nearly a decade after Silas Ward's death, a young Charlotte journalist named Robert Freeman traveled to the mountains with the intention of writing a retrospective article on the case. Freeman had heard fragmentary stories about the murderous hermit and was convinced there was a larger narrative there, something that could capture the imagination of readers across the state. Freeman spent 2 weeks in Madison County, interviewing people who had experienced the events firsthand. He spoke with Sheriff Clay, now completely gray-haired but still in office. He spoke with Joseph Martin, the hunter who had discovered the cave. He found William Pierce, who still roamed the woods with his obsessive maps. Freeman even managed to locate Timothy, now a 22-year-old living in Tennessee with his family, working as a carpenter and trying to build a normal life despite the shadows of his past. Freeman's article in the Charlotte Observer in October 1925 was well-researched and carefully written. It presented the facts of the case clearly, but also attempted to understand the larger context. Freeman wrote about the isolation of mountain communities, how the lack of adequate mental health services meant that people with serious illnesses often went unnoticed until something tragic happened. He questioned whether Silas Ward might have been helped if he had lived in a different time and place with access to appropriate treatment. The article sparked renewed interest in the case, but it was a different kind of interest than the morbid sensationalism that had dominated the initial coverage. There was now an attempt at understanding, at historical and social contextualization. Webb, who had retired from his investigative work in 1923, read Freeman's article and was impressed. He wrote a letter to the young journalist, congratulating him on his balanced approach and offering access to his personal records of the case should Freeman decide to expand the article into a book. Freeman accepted the offer and spent the next 2 years working on a comprehensive manuscript about the Silas Ward case. He traveled back to Madison County several times, documented photographs of key locations, collected more testimonies, and delved deeply into historical archives. The book, titled Shadows in the Appalachians, was published in 1928 by a small publisher in Asheville. It wasn't a national bestseller, but it sold well regionally and brought renewed attention to events many would rather forget. The book's publication had unexpected consequences. Curious tourists began showing up in Madison County, searching for the locations described in the book. They wanted to see where Silas's cabin had stood. They wanted to find the clearings in the woods. Some even tried to locate the sealed cave. Sheriff Clay, who had supported Freeman's project, now found himself forced to deal with unwanted visitors who disregarded private property and treated the real tragedy of real families as macabre entertainment. Clay eventually posted signs at the main entrances to the area where the events had occurred, warning that trespassers would be prosecuted and that there was nothing to see there. He also gave interviews to regional newspapers urging people to respect the community and its losses. Most visitors dwindled after a few months, though occasional curious people still showed up determined to explore the settings from Freeman's book. During this period of renewed attention, something unexpected happened. An elderly woman named Margaret Sullivan, living in a Knoxville, Tennessee nursing home, read about the case in the newspapers and contacted authorities with a startling story. Margaret said she had known Silas Ward many years earlier, when he still used a different name and lived in a small community in East Tennessee. She remembered him as a quiet man who occasionally worked as a blacksmith, but who had changed dramatically after suffering a serious head injury in an accident in 1906. According to Margaret, after the accident, Silas, then named Samuel Wardle, began having seizures and episodes of bizarre behavior. He spoke of visions he was having, of commands he was receiving from unseen sources. The community initially tried to help him, but his behavior became increasingly erratic and threatening. There was an incident involving the mysterious death of some farm animals that were found ritually mutilated. Although nothing was proven, Samuel became persona non grata and eventually disappeared from the community. This would have been in 1907 or 1908, exactly when Silas Ward appeared in Madison County. Webb, when he learned this information from Clay, was fascinated. Finally, there was context for understanding Silas Ward's transformation. The head injury could explain a lot. Traumatic brain injuries were known to cause profound changes in personality and behavior. If Samuel Wardell and Silas Ward were indeed the same person, then there was a clear line of progression from a relatively normal man to the monster he eventually became. Webb regretted not having had this information during the original investigation, though he acknowledged it likely wouldn't have changed the outcome. Margaret provided further details that helped fill in the gaps in Silas's story. She recalled that he had served briefly in the army years before the accident, possibly during conflicts with Native American tribes in the West. He rarely spoke about this time, but he had frequent nightmares that made him scream at night. When combined with the trauma of the head injury, it wasn't hard to imagine how his mind could have been completely shattered. Sheriff Clay attempted to verify Margaret's claims through military records, but discovered that many documents from that period were incomplete or lost. There was a Samuel Wardell listed in a regiment that served in Arizona in 1896, but without enough details to confirm it was the same person. Still, Margaret's story provided the most plausible explanation for Silas Ward's origins that had emerged so far. In 1930, the Great Depression hit the mountains of North Carolina hard, as it did the entire country. Economic hardship brought new challenges that made the events of 1916 seem increasingly distant. People worried about immediate survival, finding work, feeding their families. Stories about Silas Ward became something grandparents told their children. Warnings about the dangers of straying too far into the woods, about strangers living alone, far from society. World War II brought profound changes to the Appalachian Mountains, as well as to the entire country. Young men left to fight in distant lands, and many never returned. Families that had remained isolated for generations suddenly found themselves connected to global events in a way they had never experienced before. Madison County contributed its share of soldiers, and the war created a kind of dividing line in the community's collective memory. There was the time before the war and the time after, and the events involving Silas Ward remained firmly anchored in that increasingly distant past. Sheriff Robert Clay passed away in 1943 at the age of 74. He had served as sheriff for over 3 decades and was deeply respected in the community. At his funeral, several men who had participated in the searches and investigations of 1916 shared memories. They spoke of Clay's determination, his refusal to accept easy answers, and how he never gave up seeking justice for the victims. His successor, a younger man named Frank Morrison, inherited not only the position, but also the carefully maintained files on the Ward case. Marcus Webb died a year later in 1944 at his home in Raleigh. He was 71 years old and had been retired for over 2 decades, but he never completely stopped thinking about that case in the mountains. In his later years, Webb had lectured extensively at universities on criminal investigation techniques and frequently used the Ward case as an example of how to approach complex investigations in rural areas with limited resources. His personal archives, including hundreds of pages of notes on the case, were donated to the University of North Carolina where they would eventually become research material for criminology and history students. Timothy, the boy who had been taken in by Silas Ward, lived a long life marked by invisible scars. He married in 1928, had 3 children, and worked as a respected carpenter in his Tennessee community. But those who knew him well said there was a permanent sadness in his eyes, a distance he never fully overcame. Timothy rarely spoke about his experience with Silas, even with his own family. It was only in his later years, when his grandchildren were old enough to understand, that he finally shared his full story with them. Timothy passed away in 1987 at the age of 83, taking with him memories no one else in the world possessed. The decades that followed brought dramatic transformations to the North Carolina mountains. Roads were paved, connecting communities that once took days to reach. Electricity reached even the most remote valleys. Telephones, televisions, and eventually the internet broke the isolation that had defined mountain life for centuries. The area where Silas Ward had lived and committed his crimes became part of a state forest preserve in 1956, protected from development but open to hiking and recreational activities. Occasionally, hikers exploring the reserve's more remote trails stumbled upon traces of those ancient events. Rocks that appeared to have been deliberately arranged, trees with strange markings that had grown and warped over the decades, but were still vaguely recognizable. The sealed cave entrance could still be found if one knew where to look, though it was now completely overgrown and nearly invisible. Park rangers occasionally received questions from curious visitors about the stories they had heard, and they maintained standard answers that acknowledged the historical events but discouraged excessive exploration. By the end of the 20th century, the Silas Ward case had become a subject of fascination for historians and true crime researchers. Numerous books were written, each attempting to offer new perspectives or reveal previously unknown details. Some authors attempted to retroactively diagnose Silas with various psychiatric conditions, from schizophrenia to dissociative identity disorder. Others focused on the sociological aspects, examining how extreme isolation and a lack of community support created the conditions for tragedy to occur. Documentaries were produced, podcasts recorded episodes about the case, and websites and online forums inevitably sprang up dedicated to discussing every aspect of the crimes and the investigation. Some of these sources were reliable and well-researched. Others perpetuated myths and sensationalism. The victims' families, those descendants who were still alive, generally preferred not to be involved with these productions. They had moved on with their lives and saw no value in constantly reliving those old pains. In recent years, there has been discussion about creating some kind of memorial to Silas Ward's victims. Proposals have ranged from a simple plaque at the county courthouse to a small memorial garden. But these proposals have consistently met resistance from sections of the community who believe it would be best to let the past rest in peace. To date, no formal memorial has been established, although some descendants of the victims have created their own private tributes. Silas Ward's former homestead, now completely reclaimed by the forest, shows no visible signs of having ever lived there. The foundations of the burned-out cabin have been covered by decades of accumulated leaves and vegetation. Young trees grow where a cleared yard once stood. Nature has reclaimed the space that was briefly dominated by so much human darkness. It's a reminder that eventually even the most tragic places can be healed, at least superficially. For those studying the case today, Silas Ward represents many different things. For some, he is a classic example of how untreated mental illness can lead to tragic consequences. For others, he illustrates the dangers of extreme social isolation. Some see his case as evidence of the need for strong communities and support systems that don't let anyone fall through the cracks. And there are those who simply see him as an inexplicable monster, proof that some darkness exists that cannot be fully understood or explained. Today, more than a century after the events that shook those silent mountains, the story of Silas Ward remains one of the most disturbing and enigmatic cases in Appalachian criminal history. Madison County is a very different place than it was in 1916. Tourists flock to the region for its natural beauty, scenic trails, and rural charm. Most never hear about the dark events that occurred in those same forests so long ago. But for those who know the history, who delve into the dusty archives of county courthouses, or who speak with local elders whose grandparents lived through those days, there are lessons that echo through the decades. Silas Ward's story reminds us of the fragility of the human mind, of how trauma and isolation can distort reality in unimaginable ways. It also reminds us of the courage of ordinary people, men like Sheriff Clay and Marcus Webb, who faced evil even when they lacked all the necessary tools or knowledge. The victims of Silas Ward, Sarah Holt, Daniel Pierce, Emma Caldwell, and those others whose names we may never know for sure deserve to be remembered not just as statistics in a criminal case, but as real people with lives and dreams that were brutally cut short. Sarah was only 17, with her whole life ahead of her. Daniel was a resourceful young man, a talented tracker who knew these woods better than most. Emma was a dedicated educator, shaping the young minds of her community. Each of them left an unfillable void in their families. The question that has haunted investigators for decades remains partially unanswered to this day. What truly motivated Silas Ward? Was it merely the delusions of a mind broken by physical trauma? Was there genuine belief in the rituals he performed, however distorted? Or was there something even deeper and more disturbing at work in his psyche? The surviving records, including his fragmented diary and the testimonies of those who interacted with him, offer glimpses but not complete answers. What we know for sure is that Silas Ward managed to hide his activities for years in those isolated mountains. He exploited the geographic isolation, the cultural reluctance to interfere in others' affairs, and the lack of adequate law enforcement resources. How many more victims were there before the pattern finally became impossible to ignore? Some researchers estimate the true number of deaths may have been as high as 15 or even 20, spread over nearly a decade. We will never know for sure. The investigation that finally brought justice, though imperfect, demonstrated what was possible even with the limitations of the time. Webb and Clay worked with tireless determination, following every clue, no matter how small, meticulously documenting everything, and refusing to accept easy explanations. They didn't have forensic DNA. They didn't have computers to cross-reference data. They didn't have many of the tools modern investigators consider indispensable. But they did have persistence, intelligence, and a fierce determination to protect their community. Silas Ward's death, apparently by his own hand, denied the victims and their families the kind of closure a public trial could have provided. There was no full confession, no explanation before a court, no formal sentence, just a body found in a ravine and questions that would never be fully answered. For some, this made the case even more haunting. For others, Silas's death was justice enough, a final acknowledgement that even he knew there was no escape from what he had done. The Appalachian Mountains continue to hold their secrets. There are valleys where few humans tread, forests so dense that sunlight barely penetrates, caves that have never been fully explored. It's easy to understand how, a century ago, someone could disappear into those vast expanses and never be found. It's easy to imagine how predators, whether animal or human, could operate undetected for long periods. But it's also important to recognize that those same mountains are home to strong and resilient communities, people who care for one another, who maintain traditions of hospitality and mutual support. Silas Ward's case was an aberration, a dark stain on a landscape usually characterized by beauty and human kindness. We must not allow the actions of a single disturbed individual to define an entire region or its people. For those who visit Madison County today, whether hiking the forest preserves trails or simply taking in the stunning views of the mist-shrouded peaks, there's little to suggest the dark drama that unfolded there so long ago, and perhaps that's as it should be. Life goes on. New generations grow up unburdened by those ancient memories, and the land slowly heals its wounds. But it's important that we don't completely forget. Stories like Silas Ward's serve as reminders of why mental health systems are crucial, why we need to pay attention to signs of distress in our neighbors, why isolation can be dangerous for both the individual and those around them. They remind us of the importance of vigilant yet compassionate communities that balance respect for privacy with responsibility for collective well-being. As the sun sets over the North Carolina mountains today, casting long shadows across the valleys, it's easy to feel the weight of history. Every ridge, every forest, every meandering stream carries stories of generations who lived, loved, suffered, and persevered in that rugged land. Silas Ward's story is just one among thousands, but it's one that resonates in a particular way, one that forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about human nature, society, and the limits of our ability to understand evil. Welcome to the end of this journey through one of the darkest chapters in Appalachian history. If this story touched you in any way, if it made you reflect on the complexities of the human mind or the importance of strong communities, then it has served its purpose. These stories are not told for morbid entertainment, but to honor the victims, recognize those who sought justice, and ensure that the lessons learned are not forgotten with the passage of time. If you enjoyed this in-depth investigation into a case that shook a community over a century ago, consider subscribing to our channel for more stories that explore the mysteries and tragedies hidden in the folds of American history. Leave a comment letting us know what you thought, and if there are other historical cases you'd like us to explore. Until the next journey through the shadows of the past.